Okay, if you go ahead and grab your seats, we'll get started. I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which is going to focus on the tragedy of Native boarding schools. And we're fortunate to have with us today Theresa Sheldon. She's a citizen of the Tulalip tribes and currently serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition. Previously, Theresa served as the Native American Director for the Biden-Harris Presidential Inaugural Committee and has 16 years of advocacy experience, including roles with the Democratic National Committee, Emily's List, and the Tulalip tribes. She is the co-chair for Northwest Indians Native Vote and was a co-founding member and co-chairperson for Native Vote Washington. So join me now in welcoming Theresa Sheldon to WSU.
Haslahel, Theresa Sheldon Seedsta, Tual Chuddu Flela, Tigwid Seed for all of you being here. Again, I'm Theresa from Citizen of Tulalip Tribes, and it's an honor to be able to share with you. Thank you for spending your lunch to come learn about genocide. Like, that's never an easy topic to get into, and it's like, how do we discuss it? And at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we just are about facts. So we're not here to express opinions or worry about feelings or that. We're just factual and want to represent the true history of what has happened, how we've gotten there, and how it still impacts Native Americans in 2023. So a lot of times when we talk about current issues, people were learning about, hashtags, right? The hashtag land back, hashtag missing murdered Indigenous people, hashtag treaty rights, like honor treaties, protect the sacred, protect the salmon, remove the dams. All of these movements that are current today really stem from the beginning of colonization, the beginning of assimilation, and the beginning of genocide of Native people. And so whenever there's a conversation on Native people of why are the worst statistics for Native women, Native children, Native students, why? Like, everyone always wants to know why. That history is never a short paragraph. It's always like, well, you have to look back into federal policy and you have to look back into the creation of the United States. And so when we do that, a lot of people are really like, what do you mean, what? And so it's an educational campaign that we've been doing, trying to inform and educate that this is why we are where we're at. This is why Native Americans have some of the highest suicide rates, have some of the highest addiction rates, some of the highest dropout in high school and college rates. And so what do you do with that? How do you handle it? And how do you move forward? Is indifferent depending on where you're at and what you're coming from. The only thing we ask is after people learn these issues and learn these things, don't go to your Native friends and ask them for suggestions and solutions. Google is amazing, and there's a whole bunch of resources. Find out how to be a good ally without having to dump that onto the one or two Native students you may know. And so we constantly are pushing for do better, be better, and go beyond what we think is appropriate as an ally and for support for Native people. And so I always like to start off with that little just tangent of we know what's happened, we know where we're going, and how do we do better for the future. And I think especially now in the political climate and just addressing that it's not easy. It's not easy working on any issues, especially Native issues, when we're in a time of Christian state and a time of politics where it's dangerous, again, being a Black and brown person advocate. And so I just acknowledge that, especially being in the institution that we're in, and acknowledging the power we have as individuals and the powers we have going forward. So it's just like to say that little caveat. Who are we? What do we do? So the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is a national organization. We're actually created in 2011, 2012 with the premise of acknowledging the atrocities that have happened to Natives. In Canada, they have the Truth and Reconciliation Act. They've actually been doing this work for a good 10, 15 years ahead of us in the United States. They have gone through the Truth and Reconciliation Act where The federal government in Canada is responsible for the genocide of Native people. There's 97 recommendations to Parliament of what they need to do to restore and make Native people whole again in Canada. And so we are literally trying to catch up and do the same thing. So the same atrocities that happen there are the same that happened in the United States, and on the same lines of for why. Right? And so the organization not only works to educate, but we also work to help the survivors of boarding school. There are still a lot of current boarding school survivors today, descendants of, and those who have been impacted because of. And so that's just a little bit of who we are, what we do. One of the things we like to begin with when we talk about genocide is from our former president, Sandy Whitehawk. And she talks about when we begin to cry, that part of is a healing process. Our tears are meant to cleanse us. They're meant to cleanse our spirit, our mind, and our body. When we cried as children, no one was there. When we are left to cry alone. But today we have each other. So we always start this off with, it's okay to shed tears. It's okay to have feelings. It's okay to be angry, frustrated, perplexed, disgusted. All these emotions are acceptable. Sometimes we think we have to constantly apologize for being an emotional person. And that's a part of the assimilation, that you can't show fear, you can't show anger, you can't show frustration. And so we always begin with, it's okay. It's okay to begin with tears. It's okay to express. Because we're human. At the end of the day, we have feelings. And so this idea of not being able to do that. So if you're ever presenting on a topic and you get emotional, don't apologize. Don't apologize for having tears. Don't apologize for feeling something. Just go ahead and embrace it and allow it and move on. And we just really always start with that premise, because it's a hard topic, but we want to talk about it. So we want to have permission to be human. One of the things we start out with is the United States Department of Interior, and they had released in May the Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report. It's historical in nature, first of all. It's huge to have a Native American Department of Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland. We call her Auntie Deb, hashtag. And it is phenomenal because this is the first time the federal government has put out a report acknowledging the genocide of Native children. And so this report is full of facts we as Natives have always known, but has never been expressed from the United States government. And the significance of having a Native American in the cabinet is huge. She has the Red Road to Healing right now. She has gone on 5 different places to accept testimony from boarding school survivors, tribal leaders, and tribal citizens. And this is the first time the United States government said, tell us what we did that broke you, and tell us what we're responsible for. And so it's not done in a trauma-informed care, but it is done in a government way. So, I mean, you have, right, that's always the spiel. So our organization was with the Department of Interior when they released this report, and this report is phenomenal in so many different ways. And so we really, what we'll do is just go right into it. And we have a video, but I want to talk about the report first. And so really what this report does for the first time ever, and the whole team that worked on the report is actually Native American, which that's significant in its own as well. The Biden administration actually has the most Native political appointees in an administration of over 150 plus. And so right, wrong, or indifferent, however you voted, it's a really good place for us in the administration right now for actually being recognized and our issues being talked about and our issues being worked on from our perspective. And so the report acknowledges over 408 federal boarding schools existed in 37 states. To be a federal Indian boarding school means that the children stayed in the boarding school for long periods of time. So September to July or time frames. They stayed there overnight and did not go home to their families. So that's the definition of what a federal Indian boarding school is. Of that, they have noted it began in 1801 and goes all the way to 1969. And so there are still boarding schools in existence right now. There's over 70 of them. They're actually run by the Bureau of Indian Education, and or tribes have taken them on and now run them as a reverse flip to what boarding schools were. It's important to acknowledge that the federal government is responsible for all of these boarding schools. So they either financially ran them, provided food and or resources to them, helped build them, and all of these different other ways of supplementing the schools. And so they are actually legally responsible for this federal Indian boarding school policy era that we refer to. In the report, it acknowledges for the first time ever, the whole intent of federal Indian boarding schools was to take land. And so land during this time, we already had gone through all of the diseases. We've already gone through smallpox, of the intentional chemical warfare of killing Native people. We already went through all the Indian wars. And the United States was like, we're losing, Native people are costing too much. How do we get rid of them, and how do we get more resources? So boarding schools was that next level of a more humane way to kill and exterminate Native people. And so they focused on children, realizing from 6 years old until 16 years old was the average age. They would go as young as 3 years old, but 6 was the normal beginning of taking the children away from their families. All of this was forced. None of it was volunteered until the later years. It became volunteer when they realized, this isn't really working. Too many people are dying. We should probably change this a little bit. But what it does too is acknowledges being able to, the death of families, being able to take families and destroy the nucleus of a family. The benefit of that is your mother, your father, your auntie, your uncle, your grandparents are no longer fishing, hunting, and providing for your children. So they're leaving the most plentiful areas and not going to those areas. And so the United States government is able to take that land because it's not being used. And so it was twofold, right? You take the children and then the land isn't used, and now we can come take the land because the land is surplus land. So the third part that we talk about a lot is removing natives from the fishing and hunting territories. And the fourth is most commonly known as taking of our culture, our teachings, and our religions, cutting of our hair, removing our regalia, putting in Western clothing. Interesting enough, very early on in the 1800s, it was very organized, this level of assimilation, colonization. And they actually had a scale of civilized. And it would go from savage to civilized. And so those who empower the word savage, cool on you. I dislike the word still. But if you were considered savage, you didn't speak English, you did not wear Western clothing, and you did not eat Western food. So you were still very traditional diet, and you were still very much associated with the land you come from. Civilized meant, you're speaking English, you're wearing clothing, you're wearing hard sole shoes, and doing these kinds of things. And so the levels of treatment between a savage Indian and a civilized varied. And they did extensive research on this in the early 1800s. By 1816, they already had a roadmap of who deserved to be abused the most. And it was those who were savage. And they were identified by certain tribes too. Certain tribes that were known to be more cultural and more spiritual would receive more abuse. And that was sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, torture, starvation, neglect, all of these things. Because what they realized was if they can break the spirit of a child, those children would die instantly. Like they would just fall over and die. And that was okay, it was acceptable. Every boarding school has a cemetery. Every boarding school is not recorded. Out of this report, there was only 38 boarding school cemeteries identified. Yet we know at every boarding school there was a cemetery. So those cemeteries have yet to be identified, secured, and protected. So what the report doesn't go into, it's an amazing report, over 100 pages of intentional colonization. What it doesn't go into, though, is the exhaustive list of burial systems, nor does it identify the amount of children taken. We don't know the number. It's guesstimated 80% of all Native children were forced into boarding schools. in the beginning of it. If you refused, the parent or guardian would be sent to jail. My great-grandfather was put in jail for 30 days because he did not want his daughters to be taken. And so they were put in jail, they were fined, murdered, and whatever. The local police, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the War Department assisted with this as well. So it wasn't like only one or two were monitoring. The entire area of where schools were worked together to ensure if a child ran off that they were captured, if a child disappeared and was not found, it wasn't a big deal, as long as they weren't at home with their families. And so if they disappeared in the wilderness in the winter, no one cared. But if they made it back home, they would go home and steal them again. So it was this reoccurring thing of multiple generations that happened. Now the study also doesn't state over the 1,000+ day schools, sanitariums, asylums, orphanages, and standalone dormitories. So this is outside the definition of a federal Indian boarding school. In Washington State, we had over 29 day schools, and day schools were determined to be more effective because day schools, you would come to school, you would learn all the same things, and they would treat you the same way as a boarding school, but you would go home at night. And then you would go home at night and you would teach your parents what you learned in school. So that assimilative process happened a lot faster in day schools. And it actually had the adults becoming more assimilated quicker than it did at actual federal Indian boarding schools. And so it's interesting to see the differences. There's also, we had in Tacoma, they had the asylum, and they would send people there for different illnesses, and the children would never come home. We're now determining a lot of these medical facilities were doing experimental things to the children. And so there's proof of that through Indian Health Services, that a lot of these centers were actually trying out new techniques, new surgeries, and new things on children who are supposedly sick. They were healthy, they were fine, they just used them for these different purposes. So after this report though, what is needed, right? Once there's like this whole, here's everything, here's the dynamics. Further review is actually needed in a lot of the areas of how this has impacted the violence and trauma and how that has impacted Native children. And so the Department of Interior recognized targeting Indian children for federal assimilations. The number one was loss of life. They were like, the whole federal Indian boarding school, the worst aspect of it was the massive amount of loss of life. It was estimated that 50% of all children that went to boarding schools died, and be it for whatever various reasons is the guesstimate number. The physical and mental health, that the tortures that were taken on, the territories and wealth that were lost. Poverty is new to tribes. A lot of times we talk about Native nations and tribal nations as poor, underdeveloped, and it's just because of lack of resources and intentional federal government laws that have prohibited growth. And so these are all, like, every single one of these, 1 through 5, can be its own class of what has happened, why we've gotten here, and what do you do with it. Use of tribal languages is the most common thing we speak about when we talk about assimilation to Native people, because most of us can't speak our traditional language fluently. There are those that have tribes that have invested massive resources into protecting their languages. But of all the tribal languages, you have 576 federal Indian tribes, and there's guesstimated only 150 languages that are still spoken fluently. So there is a major concern. Every high school, you can take Spanish, French, and different languages, yet your local tribal language is not offered in high school. So there's a huge curriculum issue, there's a huge education issue, and it's multiple. It's federal, state, local level of erasure, removing, and making Native people invisible. And so it's very intentional. So when we get to today and we're just like, what? It was systematic and brilliantly used by the government on all levels. And so we're going to go into, what do you do with this, right? There's a bill we have out, and I don't know if this video will play or not, but let's try it.
Today, I'm announcing and sharing with you all, first, that the department will launch the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. At no time in history have the representation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools.
Can you put the captions on?
This investigation will identify past boarding school facilities and sites, the location of known and possible burial sites located at or near school facilities, and the identities and tribal affiliations of children who were taken there. I know that this process will be long and difficult. I know that this process will be painful. It won't undo the heartbreak and loss that so many of us feel. But only by acknowledging the past can we work toward a future that we're all proud to embrace.
I remember being afraid to sleep at night, fearful of the matron's son who walked the halls at night, using a flashlight to spot me in bed. He touched me like no child should ever be touched. As a little girl, those hands were huge.
Started to cry when the lights went out. We cried for our parents and our mothers. And it caught on. Pretty soon, the whole dorm, the whole wing of the dorm was wailing into the night. And so the next day, our eyes were closed shut. We could barely open our eyes. And that crying occurred days in and days out, and weeks in and weeks in and out and months. Until toward the middle of the school year, no child ever cried anymore. A friend of mine was a favorite of the administrator who took her out of her classroom almost on a daily basis so that he could sexually molest her in his office. She showed me her arms, and I don't know if much of you who know like hugging, but she had scars on both sides of her arms, and scars upon scars and scars. We know that she was trying to take the pain away from me, remembering of all of those sexual molestations she had. It was so bad that she developed multiple personalities. She died 5 or 6 years ago, and her stories to me is just so graphic. I knew things are bad for the voice, but I also realized that the girls suffered extremely harshly as well.
The consequences of federal Indian boarding school policies, including the intergenerational trauma caused by forced family separation and cultural eradication, which were inflicted upon generations of children as young as 4 years old, are heartbreaking and undeniable.
This is their lasting scars for all indigenous people. There's not a single American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian in this country whose life hasn't been affected by these schools.
Our children deserve to be found. Our children deserve to be brought home. We are here for their justice, and we will not stop advocating until the United States fully accounts for the genocide committed against Native children. The time is now. Tigwitsi, Haichka, Misha, Miigwech. Thanking you in our languages and praying that our languages come back with as much love and strength as our ancestors spoke them.
So Jim LaBelle, he's actually our current president now in,
If you shop at
figure out how to
Walmart,
get out of it.
you know you don't always have to go to the store.
He's our current president at NABS, and he speaks about, we talk about the crying of children, right? And he says, we always talk about the crying of children in the dorms and how they cried so much their eyes were swollen shut. He said, but we don't talk about the crying of the parents and the villages and the silence of the villages. And he said, the children were gone out of entire villages overnight. And the parents would wail and cry because there were no more children in the village. And he talks about that, how that over generation and generation and generation, how that impacts us, and how we continue to fight for normalcy, and how we continue to fight when at my reservation, the Tulalip boarding school lasted for 50 years. So that's multiple and multiple and multiple generations. So there isn't a point of when did your family break. And as science is catching up with trauma, you're learning that personality traits of childhood trauma actually create your personality as an adult. So what you think might be a strong trait of your family of independence or not relying on people is actually a trauma trait. And your family is built on all of these trauma traits, not because of empowerment or survival, but literally because of this. And so when we talk about Native issues and education, it's all related back to boarding schools. We still have a huge amount of tribal citizens who cannot and will not accept education, Western education. There is a hatred for that because of the trauma associated with that. There's trauma associated with dentists, with doctors, and with medical professions. And so when you have a community that is so based in trauma, when do you ever get out of it? Where does that start, and what is the change occur? So one of the things that we're working on in the United States is actually a bill in Congress. So this bill was introduced in the last legislation. It will have to be reintroduced in the 118th Congress. But this bill, for the first time ever, would actually acknowledge the United States government did this. So one, there hasn't been an acknowledgement. Two, there hasn't been an apology and acceptance of what that means has done to Indigenous people. And this includes the Hawaiians, it includes and if you actually look at every US territory, they did this to every Indigenous people. So anywhere in the United States of power, of authority, they have done this historically because they know it works. And so we have a bill in Congress now that will have to be reintroduced. And the bill really will look into creating a commission. So the commission's responsibility will be to do a full inquiry into the assimilative policies of the United States Indian boarding school policy era. So that whole 150, 200 years of what does that mean? How has it taken place? And even going further than the Department of Interior, because it wasn't just the Department of Interior, it was the military, it was all of the IRS, like the taxes, all of the cabinets that worked together to ensure these policies happened. It was very systematic. And so when we talk about systemic racism in the law and in the government, 100% is the proof is Native people's lives today. So the commission will be responsible for collecting testimony from survivors, from tribes, subject matter experts. There's a lot of people that have written books on individual boarding schools and have done a lot of research on an individual boarding school because of their family legacy that comes from that. And so none of that is anywhere though. It's all just out there. So one of the things at NABS that we're doing is creating an actual database that will be utilized to house all of this information. And you'll be able to search for your relatives in the database by name, by tribe, by location. One of the things they were very good at is they learned that they had to remove you from your territory. So you'll see a lot of Alaskan Natives were sent down here to the lower 48 and sent to Washington State. A lot were sent to Montana, South Dakota, and all the way over to Pennsylvania was a big one, because they realized you had to leave your territory, otherwise you would run away and you knew how to get home. So they would ship you out. And then boarding schools also highlighted their best students and would trade students and send students to different boarding schools to highlight how successful they were being assimilated and colonized and into this. And so this commission will really create and disseminate a report on all of this and recommendations. We expect it to be similar to what Canada has done, where Canada came out with 97 recommendations. And the recommendations were consistent from all the way from mental health issues to education issues to cultural issues to economics as a tribe and the whole gamut. So we expect similar type of recommendations to come out of it. And it'll really go beyond what the Department of Interior scope can be. One of the significant things is the United States in 1819 passed a law that religious institutions can run boarding schools on behalf of the United States government. And so that began in 1819. So the majority of boarding schools are run by different religious institutions. Those religious institutions still have the records. In Canada, it's the same thing. And in Canada, none of the religious institutions have turned over a single document on the students that have gone to their schools. So the bill in the United States would have subpoena powers to be able to subpoena religious institutions, private organizations, local governments for records that they have on tribal students. And it's a limited jurisdiction of subpoena power. So it's limited to the time frame, that it was actually related to them, the boarding school, and it could be land, taxes, student, deaths, infirmaries, any of that can be subpoenaed if they're unwilling to do that. So this is significant in giving this commission authority to actually do a full-on investigation into it. And so that is one of the major sort of holdups, is that it would have subpoena powers. Now, we've had over 30 plus religious organizations support us and put in letters of support for the bill. We've not had one single religious organization that has opposed the bill. And so that's significant going forward. We have a lot that have come forward and said, hey, we'll give you records. What do we have to do? And we're like, absolutely, we'll take them. Now, they've not given us any, but they constantly let us know they'll share, but we haven't gotten any. So we look forward to being able to gather that information when it is appropriate and happens. So this is our more positive video, but the volume is really low. What do we? Oh, it's only a one minute or so. So this one will...
ACIS. Hello, friends. Every Indigenous, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian has the right to truth.
We have the right to know the truth about what happened in Indian boarding schools in the United States. This starts an accurate accounting of the number of our relatives who were forced as children to attend these schools.
To ensure this never happens again, we need to know the truth about how many of our relatives were abused, died, or went missing.
Every American Indian, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian has a right to healing.
Every Native person in our country carries the trauma and the harm of Indian boarding school policies in their blood and genetic memory.
To heal, we need to know the long-term impacts and implications of these institutions of racism, white supremacy, and genocide have had on our children and families, past, current, and future generations.
The irreparable harm cannot be undone, but we as a country can begin to acknowledge and reconcile. That is the foundation for a future of healing that our boarding school survivors and their descendants deserve.
Every Native citizen, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian has a right to dignity, restoration, and an opportunity to share their stories.
A Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools is a necessary first step for our country to address long overdue injustices experienced by generations of our relatives.
The time for healing is now. We can't wait any longer. Our relatives deserve dignity to share their stories of the harm they've suffered, the trauma, and the resilience.
Our children and families are still dealing with the generational impacts of Indian boarding schools, and we demand restorative actions that are written in a policy, as well as a direct resource that helps our tribal communities revitalize and restore our culture, language, and well-being of our children, families, and tribal nations.
We are in a time of truth-telling, so let's take action together. We ask each of you to call key congressional leaders to enact the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policy Act,
which calls for a full inquiry and accurate accounting into the assimilative policies of the U.S. Indian boarding schools, including a full examination of boarding school archival records and the ability to subpoena documents if not brought forward.
Culturally appropriate public hearings for survivors, descendants, and subject matter experts to provide testimony and inform institutional knowledge gathering. The creation and dissemination of commission findings and recommendations shared publicly that will set the foundation for policy recommendations that work toward restoring the culture, language, and well-being of our children and families.
A comprehensive investigation that goes beyond the Department of Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative and builds upon all previous research. The time is now.
The time is now. The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
The time is now.
Please call your senators and congressional members today, requesting they pass H.R. 5444 and S. 2907, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policy Act.
So the bill currently, the co-leads of the bill are the Senate Committee Indian Affairs, which is Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska and Senator Schatz from Hawaii. And then Elizabeth Warren is the lead on the Senate side. The lead on the House side is Representative Tom Cole from Oklahoma and Representative Sharice Davids from Kansas. And so together we are working to reintroduce the bill. So it'll have new bill numbers, but it will maintain the same point, and the whole purpose of the bill will be the same going forward. So we actually go to DC on February 20th to meet with all 5 of the offices to start finalizing the bill language for reintroduction. We expect, because the House is the House and we're in the most different political time we've ever been, which I think every year we're constantly like, oh my God, this is the worst we've ever seen it. And then next year happens, we're like, just kidding. It continues to escalate. And so one of the beautiful things we have is this great toolkit that we've organized for the bill. And it has the bill language, the background, who we are, the NABs, and it's just one of the things that we can actually put into action. And so one of the big things that will be going forward is getting it through the natural resources on the House side. That's the committee that has jurisdiction over it, with the education and workforce, the new committee, they've renamed it, will be the ones that have dual action. When the Natural Resource Committee held the hearing this last May, it was the first time ever in the United States history boarding school survivors were able to tell their story in Congress. So the testimony you've seen with Ramona, Dr. Ramona Klein and Jim LaBelle on here was the first time ever that's happened. And that was just here in 2022. And so it was phenomenal that they were actually able to tell their stories. This bill has had the most responses in writing. The House's Natural Resource received over 200 written comments of support for the bill, and they have never had that much actual letters from individual tribal citizens on a bill before. And it was every single one of them telling their own personal story of why the United States government needs to take responsibility. And so as we move forward, action is absolutely necessary. Once the bill has new numbers, and then we constantly have our call to action on social media. The National Native American Boarding School has a Facebook page, an Instagram page, Twitter, we're like, and so it's just one of those things that anyone and everyone can help do once it's reintroduced. And so it's an honor to be able to share this with all of you and share these stories and these testimonies and just the truth of where we're at. My skirt that I'm wearing today actually represents the 4 generations that I come from. And so I'm actually named after my great-grandmother, Theresa, who attended the Tulalip boarding school, which is why she is wearing her orange dress. And then my grandmother, Nola, who also attended the boarding school, who intentionally is in black because I only knew her as a broken person who was extremely mean and abusive. And then my mother, who I represent in purple, was the first of our family to acknowledge the actual sexual abuse that was happening in our family from boarding schools. And she is a survivor of 6 years old, and at 13 years old was already suicidal and trying to take her life. And so suffered her entire life. She died 2 years ago, and I say she died of trauma, but on her death certificate it says liver failure. And so trauma, science is telling us the things of how your heart goes out, your liver goes out, and your kidney goes out. And so Native Americans are dying at a high rate of premature deaths due to trauma. And so how do you deal with that, and what do you go forward? And the first is recognizing that we're actually in a trauma problem. And so it's easy to say we have a diabetes problem, or we have a food problem, or we have a mental health problem, we have a suicide problem, addiction problem, right? It's easy to put it into categories, but really the basis is the trauma of intergenerational that we have and we continue to carry on. And so how do you get out of it as an entire nation? A lot of times when we talk about Native people, we always have to remind them that we're tribal, we're actual sovereign nations with treaty rights, and that we're not a minority group. And it's really important to remind people that Native people are not minority groups. We're actually a political class of people that have secured rights from the United States Constitution, treaties, and all of the federal laws. And so how that looks and how that's played out is different for every single tribe and every single family within the tribe. Some have done so much great work on themselves and have gotten farther in their own healing, and others have not. And so the disparities within tribal communities are drastic. And so those that have make it to a university, the significance of them just being in a university is huge for our communities and for our tribes. And it's never to dismiss that. Just being in a university is such a privilege that many of our people will never obtain. And know that even if you sit here and you sit in these chairs as a Native person, that you're not responsible for your whole nation. We carry that weight, and we carry our families here with us, and that's not your responsibility to do that. It's okay to show up as your own individual self as a Native person and be like, I can only do me right now, and that's okay, because that's enough. And so I just really want to end it on appreciation and thank you for allowing me here. And I know we wanted to do some question and answers, and please feel free to ask, because I know people are like, I don't want to say anything, oh my God. And it's okay, because that's what we're here to learn. And
thanks for a very informative and moving presentation. So we have about 10 minutes, or a little more than 10 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start off. I was curious, you talked a lot about Canada being further along in this process. Are there any significant differences in how the U.S. and the Canadian policies played themselves out? And if there were, are they going to be reflected in recommendations made?
No, they're pretty similar because in early 1800s, they constantly shared of best ways to deal with Native problems. And so Canada took a more humane approach and sort of got on this track earlier than the United States, where the United States was like, well, we're just going to kill them and we're going to have Indian wars. And then they were like, oh, this is too expensive. So constantly when you're doing federal Indian policy, you realize policy shifts only occur because the United States was like, it's too expensive, this isn't working, and they're not dying fast enough. It was literally just about constantly exterminating us through law and through policies. And so very similar to Canada, there are not major differences at all. I would just say there's more of them that survived, and that may just have been because of the distance versus us, where we just had more. Any major city completely annihilated Native people at such an early point in time. And so that erasure started a lot earlier in the United States and it did in Canada.
does this bill or other bills, how does this address, right, child stealing did not stop with the boarding schools.
Nope.
And it was under attack, and that
Yep.
political classification is what's under attack with ICWA, right? So they're trying to racialize instead of politicize.
Mhm.
And so how does, beyond the boarding schools and the other issues of child stealing, how does?
They're completely related.
Yeah.
So Indian child welfare is completely related to boarding schools.
Yeah.
It's just new terms and new titles.
Yeah.
And so we don't bring up that because we don't want to be attacked under that, but it's actually in the bill. So the Indian child welfare is in the bill. The language is in there, and there's a section on it because they're directly linked. So our Native children have not stopped being taken. It's just different names and different policies. And so we still have the most Native American children in the protective services, like unjustly. So we still have a huge rate of Native children taken from their families, adopted out to non-Native families, and it's just under a different law and different name. So just because the boarding school policy era died, the colonization assimilation hasn't. It's just changed names.
This presentation made me think, I'm from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, but Mary Peltola, I know that she is the first Alaska Native woman to be elected to Congress, and what's she been doing with, this, or just in general?
So Mary signed on as a co-sponsor. Don Young, he signed on as a co-sponsor too. The last legislation, we had 87 co-sponsors in the House. And so Don Young signed on, Mary Peltola signed on. Mary Peltola is the first Native Alaskan to serve in Congress in Alaska. Over 229 federal Indian tribes are in Alaska, and she's the first. So she's an absolute badass. Her slogans literally are pro-fish, pro-family, and pro-choice. So she's doing amazing things, and we expect her to be one of the lead champions on this bill.
Actually, I just want to add one more thing. I'm taking a gender and politics class because I'm a poli-sci major, and I was like, she looks, I don't know a whole lot about her, so I was gonna, we have to do a report on the female politicians, but I decided to do her because I didn't know a whole lot about it, and I voted for her, so.
Yeah, she's amazing. Yeah, she's so pleasant to meet with too, and her staff is fabulous.
What kind of policy recommendations are you hoping to see that come out of if this commission is passed through law and instated? What kind of policies are you hoping that they recommend?
Well, first, really, we want is the President of the United States to apologize. So that apology hasn't happened. When you're talking about healing and justice, and you're talking about an entire nation of people, there's not one way that'll work, right? So in Canada, one of their requirements was that the Pope apologize. The majority of schools in Canada were Catholic. So this summer, they had the Pope come out and he apologized. Now, some people were like, F the Pope, I don't need that. Some absolutely needed it, right? And they were just like devout Catholics still and had to hear the apology. And his apology was beautiful and amazing. Unfortunately, they gave him a headdress, and then that became our social media memes, which we love social media memes, Native people do, making fun of people. And that took away from the moment because he literally said it was genocide. Because they asked him, how come you don't say this is genocide? And the Pope was like, I just didn't think about it, but you're right, it was and is. And so I expect the policy recommendations to be very huge along the gamut of basic responsibility, taking responsibility. Now, we can't use the words of restitution or anything like that because then people are like, well, what about slavery and how do you deal with that? And it's like, it should be dealt with 100%. But right now, we're just going to deal with Native people and what that looks like. So how do you make people whole from genocide, and what does that look like? And we expect that to be a heavy influence of education and curriculum. Native students still have like the worst dropout rate, the worst reading, math, retention rates, just nationally. And so what are we doing about that? Where's curriculum at? Why are Native people still talked about in past tense? How come we're only talked about in the 1800s of the United States and not current day, because we're still here? So there's a massive area in curriculum that has to be developed. Especially with textbooks and children books. If book reports begin in 3rd grade, yet if there are not books on Native tribes in 3rd grade, how do you do books on Native people? book reports. So it's really the whole cause and effect of education and looking at. We have a lot of plentiful resources in college because we have so many amazing Native scholars now who are writing books. So there's a lot, but there's not K to 12, we have a lack of resources. And who's responsible is the hard part when it comes to education, because everyone's like, oh, well, tribes should pay for it because you have a casino. The fact is tribes' casinos literally fund their government. So the United States taxing has not allowed tribes and has preempted tribes from taxing, basic taxing. You can't be a government without taxing authority. So most tribes thrive off taxing their own people and their own things that are happening because of the preemptions that have taken place. So that racism in law has stopped tribes from economically growing like any other government would because of that. And so we expect that to be talked about in this as well, is those kinds of things like that. And then you go into the whole mental health, spiritual aspect of what is trauma, what it has happened. So trauma-informed care is the new buzzword. What does that mean? The pandemic has showed us we have a huge lack of Black and brown therapists for our communities. And that is 100% true in Native tribes. There's a lack of mental health professionals to actually do this kind of work. And interesting enough, we're seeing different ways to deal with PTSD and all of these traumas, childhood traumas, in different plant medicines. And our people have always been plant medicine people, but it's like all of the medical fields are catching up to what we have always known. It was the pandemic that let everyone know sage actually cleans out negative ions, and we're like, duh, but stop over harvesting. So these things that our people have always believed in, but we weren't able to do them or have access to. And so I expect it to be the full gamut of everything and anything to really look at it in that aspect.
Thank you.
I think the point about getting the data is really important. And some of the First Nations in Canada went to the Vatican and demanded in Vatican City the data, but if you
and they still haven't given it to them.
I know, but they'll wear headdresses and say sorry. But yeah, if you could just talk about getting that documentation, I think is important.
Data in general, if you Google data in general on Native Americans, it's very little. So if you want to know how many Native Americans voted in the last election, you're not going to find it. Like, it doesn't exist. We get so excited because Obama was the first one to put us in the list of people of color. And he'd be like, Black, Asian, Native American. We're like, oh my God, he sent us. But literally, we don't have data on us. So I worked for the Democrat National Committee for 3 years and never had data on Native vote. And that's an issue. So constantly, we're not shown and represented. And so we know we exist. We know where we're at. We know the populations, and we know every city that has a major urban area of Native people, which was intentional and was a federal policy too to put us in cities. So the fact that the majority of live off reservation was intentional by the federal government too, and now you're penalized for not being on your reservation. So it's like constant.
So time for one quick last question.
For that data being collected, is there a possible way for that data to be used for federally recognized tribes to collect and find a lot of their lost tribal members? Because this has a direct line to the violation of our blood quantum and how we're losing active members. So if this were to be passed, would that data be also used vice versa for tribal members to be found that were lost in that?
100%. So interesting enough, if you look at when tribes constitutions, every single tribe has a constitution, executive order that establishes their government. So most of those started in the early 1900s, after the federal boarding school policy era was coming to an end of being forced. And so interesting enough, all of those constitutions lay out how you become a citizen in a tribe. Many of them have blood quantum, many of them have requirements of how you become a citizen. Now at this point, if you had gone through a federal Indian boarding school, you did not want to be Native. You wanted to get the F out and you wanted to leave. My great-grandfather, that Sisseton Wahpeton Sioux, he actually never went back to his reservation after boarding school, never. He said, I'll never go back, and he never did. He never went home. After his experience. So the constitutions that were put in place were from the Bureau of Indian Education. And these constitutions that now regulate tribal government that were established from the federal government tell us who is and who isn't a citizen of our sovereign nations. That's the part of being sovereign. You get to debate that. But what we don't acknowledge is the requirements of that was given to us from the federal government. We now embrace that as ours. Once you have anything over 40 years, it's tradition. And we're like, no, it's ours and we love it. And so there are so many assimilative things that tribal governments do that don't even realize why they do it. It's just because it's always been that way. So citizenship is a huge issue. Blood quantum is a huge issue. And anyone who's done case law, blood quantum comes from case law. And it was literally to keep somebody who was pale and they had actual black descendancy out of first class on a train. So it had nothing to do like with Native people. It had to do all with racism. And so racism in the law has dictated how we are here in 2023. And we still have to overcome it, and it's major obstacles. And so blood quantum, citizenship, all of that is heavily stemmed in colonization and assimilation. And a lot of tribes who are on the healthy spectrum, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and who have been able to protect their traditional ways of living, have gone back to more of a traditional way of citizenship.
Okay, unfortunately, our time's up. Before we thank our guest, let me remind you, our next event is next Friday. On the 17th, we have Governor Inslee coming. Unfortunately, that event's full already. But you can watch it online. We live stream all of our events, including today's event. So I encourage you to join us then. But now join me in thanking Theresa Sheldon for a really informative.